In a forgotten corner of Ohio, where the wind moves like a voice trying to remember something long buried, one man's life stretched beyond the limits of nature itself. His name was Caesar Bowen, and according to official county records, he lived to 126 years old, a span so impossible that even modern science still refuses to touch it. Yet the deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. Because Caesar didn't just outlive his generation, he carried memories that no single man should possess. Memories that seemed to belong to other men entirely, two short breaths, one long truth. You're about to step into a mystery so unsettling that historians tucked it away for over a century, hoping no one would dig it up again. But you're here now, and once you hear what was found inside Caesar's cabin after his death, you'll understand why this story refuses to stay buried, the impossible mystery of the O. Before we dive into the dark heart of this legend, breathe for a second. If you're the kind of person who lives for hidden history rabbit holes and mysteries that scratch at the back of your mind long after the screen goes dark, consider hitting subscribe. Not out of obligation, just because stories like this deserve an audience that can handle the truth. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It helps this channel reach more curious minds like you. The morning the men of Grayford first saw Alden Rourke, he emerged from the fog like a figure carried forward by centuries, his boots worn thin, his eyes steady with a knowledge older than the town itself. He walked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, two short steps followed by one long sweep of motion, as if measuring the earth beneath him, as if each movement confirmed he still belonged in a world moving faster than memory. Every man watching felt a quiet chill, the kind that slides beneath the skin, because something in Alden's face hinted he had lived far beyond any natural span, carrying years that did not properly belong to him. He spoke rarely those first hours, answering questions with a calm, almost practiced brevity, his voice low and graveled, shaped by decades of wind and silence, giving the impression he had rehearsed these moments many times before. When the sheriff asked his age, Alden paused long enough for unease to spread, then replied with a simple number that sounded impossible, forcing several men to exchange looks that held both disbelief and wounded curiosity. No records existed, no family lines traced, no gravestone markers bearing his name, yet Alden described events with such clean detail that older townsmen found themselves nodding despite every rational instinct screaming to reject him. He recalled wars fought before their grandfathers were born, battles of men whose names had long faded, recounting the smell of gunpowder on frozen mornings with a clarity so sharp it unsettled even the most hardened listener. His hands alone seemed evidence of unnatural time, their skin etched like ancient bark, yet still capable of subtle precision, fingers moving in patterns suggesting muscle memory shaped by centuries of repetition and forgotten craft. By sundown, men followed him with cautious respect, not through awe but through an instinctual recognition that Alden carried some burden none of them wished to inherit, a heaviness settling in the quiet spaces between his words. He requested lodging outside town, choosing a decaying shed rather than any warm home offered, claiming he slept better near open ground where the earth felt familiar beneath him, as though anchoring something fragile within. At night, men reported seeing him stand motionless under the moon, eyes fixed on distant horizons only he seemed capable of reading, as if scanning for memories drifting toward him on unseen currents. Whispers spread quickly among the miners and rail workers, each man adding a fragment to the growing legend, building a story around Alden before he'd spoken 50 words in their presence. The blacksmith claimed Alden recognized a tool design abandoned 70 years earlier, describing how it failed under winter pressure, speaking with the weary certainty of someone who'd watched it break during another lifetime. The preacher insisted Alden refused every mention of faith, not out of rejection but out of an exhaustion older than doctrine, like a man who had prayed through entire eras and outlived the promises he once trusted. The barkeep swore Alden never drank more than a single swallow, saying too much made the memories louder, though he never explained what that meant, leaving men staring into their mugs with uncomfortable silence. Around the 15th hour after his arrival, a storm rolled in fast, bending the trees sideways, and Alden stepped outside into the downpour as if greeting an old companion returning from distant travels. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his silhouette, and several men watching swore that, just for a moment, Alden appeared younger beneath the flash, as if the storm briefly peeled away some impossible layer of accumulated age. When asked about it later, Alden only smiled faintly, the kind of smile men reserve for painful truths, and said storms remind him of nights when the world felt smaller, when time moved differently. He never elaborated, leaving only the echo of implication, and men carried that echo home with them, unable to shake the feeling that Alden's life stretched across eras none of them had studied deeply enough to understand. By the second day, men noticed Alden avoided reflective surfaces, turning his head away from windows and water troughs, as if seeing his own face might complicate a fragile balance he worked tirelessly to maintain. He kept his belongings in a single weathered pack, each item wrapped carefully in cloth, each handled with a reverence suggesting they once belonged to men he had known intimately across lifetimes. Among these items was a small iron ring worn nearly flat, and Alden traced its edges whenever he thought no one watched, his expression tightening with restrained grief, as though hearing a voice fading across centuries. The men of Greyford began approaching him cautiously, asking for stories around the fire, hoping to understand the stranger who seemed to have stepped out of history itself. But Alden always offered fragments rather than full truths. One night, he spoke of a battlefield covered in frost where men marched barefoot, their breath rising like ghosts, and though his tone remained steady, every man listening felt the weight of lives lost beneath those memories. Another evening, he described a long march through desert heat, carrying a wounded companion across miles of sand, sharing water drop by drop, though he never revealed whether that companion survived the journey. Alden's stories carried no embellishment, no pride, no dramatics, only the weary neutrality of a man who had lived through too much to seek admiration for what survival demanded from him. Men found themselves leaning in, held not by spectacle, but by an inexplicable gravity, because every sentence carried a truth deeper than the words spoken, stirring questions they feared to ask directly. As days passed, Alden's presence began reshaping the town's rhythm, men waking earlier, listening harder, feeling some pressure inside them shift, as though his quiet witness reminded them how little time truly belonged to them. Yet Alden walked among them with the stillness of someone carrying centuries on his shoulders, each step measured, each breath deliberate, as if he was trying to outpace memories pressing against the edges of his mind. And in the early hours of the seventh morning, while the sky bled into pale blue, Alden finally revealed the truth. None of the men had dared to voice the truth that would change Greyford forever. He stood outside the shed, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and said he did not come to live among them but to wait for something approaching him slowly across time, something he could no longer outrun. When Alden stepped into the abandoned rail depot at dawn, the men following him sensed the shift immediately, a heaviness settling across the cracked floorboards, as though the air carried memories pressing forward faster than his aging body could withstand. He removed his coat slowly, movements deliberate and strained, revealing shoulders marked with scars forming patterns that suggested battles fought long before any living man in Greyford had drawn his first breath. The depot smelled of rust and coal dust, but Alden inhaled deeply as if recognizing the scent from some life already spent, his gaze drifting toward shadows where no man stood, acknowledging presences only he could perceive. Several men waited silently, boots scraping nervously against planks, watching Alden pace the length of the room with the posture of someone trying to outrun the echo of centuries clawing their way toward him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a trembling undercurrent none had heard before, the tone of a man losing ground against something inside him, something carved from countless forgotten lives. He said the years did not accumulate naturally but arrived in sudden waves, memories flooding like cold water through a cracked door, each surge stealing a piece of him while returning fragments belonging to other men long dead. Alden pressed a palm to the wooden wall, steadying himself, whispering that the ache in his bones was not age alone, but the weight of identities layered like sediment, shifting unpredictably beneath his skin. The men exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something unraveling, as Alden's breathing slowed to a rhythm unnervingly controlled, as though he were bracing for another arrival of memories riding in from abandoned eras. He described nights when unfamiliar grief woke him violently, grief belonging to men he'd never met, their final thoughts settling in his mind like heavy stones dropped into a bottomless well. His eyes grew distant as he explained that each borrowed memory spoke through him eventually, shaping his voice, reshaping his posture, as if every man he carried were waiting for a moment to be acknowledged. Alden's hands shook subtly as he stretched them before the men, showing how sometimes they appeared younger in the lamplight, sometimes older, depending on which memory pressed closest to the surface. The blacksmith stepped forward cautiously, asking nothing, offering only presence, and Alden nodded appreciatively, grateful for silent company in a world where every spoken word risked inviting another memory forward. A sudden gust rattled the depot windows, and Alden stiffened, saying the wind carried echoes of a battlefield he never fought on, yet remembered with unbearable clarity, every fallen man calling out through him. He paced again, slower this time, dragging a hand across crates as if needing contact with something solid, grounding himself against visions that threatened to ripple across his consciousness without warning. At midday, the men built a small fire inside the depot, its warmth circling them, and Alden sat beside it, saying fire always helped separate his own memories from those that did not belong to him. He spoke of an unfamiliar childhood, describing a stone riverbank beneath a foreign sun, a memory that brought him to tears because it felt like losing a father he never truly had. The men listened, every detail carving deeper lines of fear and fascination into their expressions, each story confirming that Alden's burden expanded beyond mere longevity into something far stranger. He described waking one morning speaking a dialect no man in Grayford recognized, the voice rising from his throat with practiced ease as though belonging to another man entirely. He said some memories arrived peacefully, like quiet visitors taking shelter, while others crashed into him violently, forcing his heart into erratic rhythms until he feared it would stop entirely. Alden leaned forward, gripping his knees, saying the worst were the memories carrying dying breaths, final thoughts of men fading into darkness, their last fragile moments preserved painfully within him. His eyelids fluttered as another wave approached, and he begged the men to keep their distance, warning that proximity sometimes triggered stronger manifestations that twisted his voice into one not originally his. For several minutes, his body went rigid, then trembled with the force of memories pulling at him, until his shoulders finally relaxed and he inhaled shakily, reclaiming his own name with effort. He confessed to forgetting himself at times, unable to recall which life belonged to him, fear rising like smoke as he wondered whether his identity still held shape at all. The men stayed close yet dared not touch him, sensing that any physical contact might invite another soul to speak through him, blurring the fragile boundaries Alden fought desperately to maintain. He said each memory arrived through sensation, first a familiar ache, a remembered sound, a scent tied to a man whose life had ended generations earlier, all rising through him like ghosts seeking brief resurrection. As dusk approached, Alden's strength waned, his voice cracking as he admitted he felt another presence forming inside him, pushing forward with the persistence of someone refusing to stay forgotten. He clenched his fists, refusing the memory entry, but the force of it drove him to his knees, and several men rushed forward before halting abruptly, unsure what touch might unleash. A low groan escaped him, not of pain but of recognition, as though greeting a man he tried desperately to keep buried, a presence returning with the inevitability of a rising tide. Alden whispered that this one was different, older, heavier, carrying the sorrow of an entire bloodline, a memory forged in hardship so deep it split across generations. Night settled heavily around the depot, shadows deepening with each breath Alden took, and the men felt the temperature drop, as if the arriving memory carried cold from a distant era. When Alden finally lifted his head, his eyes held a clarity none had seen before, a clarity belonging not to him but to the man whose memory had just taken its place beside his own. The night began with an unnatural stillness, a silence so complete the men of Grayford felt as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for Alden to confront something that had chased him across lifetimes. He stood in the center of the rail depot, lanterns flickering around him, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls as if reaching toward him, responding to a presence that had not yet fully revealed itself. His breathing came slow and measured, two short inhales followed by one long exhale, a rhythm that hinted at effort, as though he were steadying himself against a rising wave of memories pressing violently inward. Men formed a loose circle around him, boots planted firmly, each one sensing that something in the room had shifted, something older than Alden himself creeping through the cracks like a gathering storm. Alden's voice trembled when he spoke, not with fear but with an exhaustion carved over centuries, saying the presence inside him had grown heavier throughout the day, preparing to break through completely. The lantern smoke curled toward him unnaturally, twisting in strange patterns as his eyes shifted from their usual calm to a distant focus, like he was staring through walls into memories layered across eras. He warned the men not to approach, explaining that the presence now pushing forward was stronger than any he had carried before, a memory belonging to someone whose life ended violently and refused to stay buried. A low hum filled the depot, faint at first, then growing steadily until the walls vibrated, and Alden pressed both hands against his skull, as if trying to contain a voice screaming from inside. The men stepped back instinctively as the temperature plummeted, their breath fogging in the air, and Alden whispered a name none of them recognized, spoken with a grief so profound it stole sound from the room. He staggered forward, gripping a support beam, saying the memory was ancient, older than his own earliest years, belonging to a man whose final moments had burned so deeply they scarred themselves into time. Alden gasped as the voice pushed through him, his features shifting momentarily, his posture altering, as though another man were physically adjusting his spine, shoulders, and breath to speak through his borrowed body. The first words from his mouth were not in any language known to Grayford, but every man felt the weight of them, a cadence built from pain carried over generations, rising like echoes from cracked earth. Alden's voice deepened, resonance shifting, and he described fire closing in around him, describing heat with a vividness so visceral the men felt their own skin tighten, imagining flames they had never witnessed. He spoke of betrayal by men he trusted, describing torches raised against him, a memory Alden had no place knowing, yet the emotion carried the unmistakable truth of a man reliving his final breath. The lanterns guttered violently, and Alden's hands clenched until blood formed crescents on his palms, his body shaking with the force of the memory anchoring itself inside him, refusing to remain silent. The presence within him demanded recognition, and Alden surrendered briefly, letting the words pour from him in a torrent, describing smoke-thick nights, splintered doors, and the sound of men shouting vengeance. Every man watching could feel the presence filling the room, pressing against them like a storm wind, pushing their hearts into faster rhythms as the memory's rage seeped into the air. Alden collapsed to his knees, gripping the floorboards as if grounding himself, saying the memory had waited for centuries, searching for a voice strong enough to carry its weight into the present. He begged the men not to interfere, explaining that resistance would only fragment the memory further, causing the presence to lash out blindly, tearing through him with the force of unresolved fury. His breathing grew ragged, shifting between short gasps and tremors, and his voice twisted again, this time cracking with an exhaustion that spoke of countless years spent searching for a single moment of release. Alden's eyes glazed over as the memory flooded him fully, and he described the final sensation that man felt: cold earth beneath his cheek, a fading heartbeat, and a last desperate plea swallowed by darkness. A silence followed, deep and oppressive, broken only when Alden exhaled shakily, saying the memory had not come seeking revenge but recognition, longing simply to be acknowledged after centuries of suffocating erasure. He whispered that this was only the beginning, that dozens of voices stirred inside him now, drawn closer by the presence that had broken through, each waiting impatiently for their turn to be witnessed. The men shifted uneasily, feeling unseen eyes watching them from the corners of the room, as if every voice inside Alden had stepped forward, crowding around them in a circle of silent anticipation. Alden rose unsteadily, saying the memories responded to the town's presence, to the gathering of men willing to hear truths long buried, truths that weighed heavier than any grave marker could bear. He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, saying the boundary inside him was thinning, each voice pushing harder, eager to step into the world through him, their desperation tightening like a vice. Another wave surged, and Alden leaned against a broken crate, sweat beading across his brow, whispering that the voices were speaking to each other now, arguing, demanding, fighting for the chance to be heard. The depot groaned as if bearing weight, wooden beams creaking in sympathy with Alden's struggle, and every man present braced himself for the next voice pressing through the fragile barrier inside him. Alden's breath hitched sharply, shoulders locking, and his mouth fell open as another memory took shape behind his eyes, rising with the unstoppable certainty of a tide returning to claim a long-abandoned shore. Dawn crept slowly over Grayford, dragging pale light across the depot's fractured windows as Alden stood at the edge of the platform, his silhouette trembling with the strain of holding dozens of voices clawing for release within him. His posture had changed overnight, shoulders drawn forward, as if the invisible weight pressing down had tripled, every borrowed memory tightening around him like iron bands forged from centuries of unresolved suffering. The men who arrived at first light sensed immediately that Alden was nearing some irreversible threshold, his breath shallow and uneven, his expression hollowed by the relentless pull of identities demanding their final acknowledgement. He turned toward them with a calm that felt unnaturally still, saying the memories had grown restless, shifting violently during the night, each voice fighting to be the last one he carried before the inevitable collapse. Alden's eyes drifted toward the horizon as though searching for some distant landmark, claiming he could see fragments of lives drifting like smoke across early morning light, memories separating themselves in preparation for departure. The air seemed thicker around him, each breath labored, and Alden explained that the barrier between his consciousness and theirs had thinned so drastically, he could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from theirs. He said their voices crowded his mind in overlapping waves, arguing, pleading, whispering final confessions, and every word carved deeper cracks into the fragile structure of his remaining identity. Alden sank onto a crate, hands shaking uncontrollably, saying he felt time folding inward, centuries collapsing onto each other, the memories pulling away like threads unraveling from a frayed tapestry. His voice trembled as he confessed that some memories resisted departure, clinging to him desperately, terrified of dissolving into silence after waiting lifetimes to be remembered by a living mind. He bowed his head, whispering names that surfaced like drowning men grasping for air, each one belonging to someone whose story had withered in the shadows until Alden had carried it into the light. The men gathered closer as Alden described the sensation of losing himself, each breath scattering fragments of his identity, his own memories flickering like dying embers smothered beneath colder, older recollections. He looked up, eyes glassy with exhaustion, saying he could feel the final presence moving forward, heavier than any before it, bearing a lifetime scarred deeply enough to darken the air around him. A low vibration spread through the depot floorboards as Alden's body tensed, his jaw tightening, his spine rigid, the force of the final memory pressing outward with the inevitability of a storm breaking open. A strangled sound escaped him as the presence reached full clarity, and the men stepped back instinctively, sensing the raw depth of a life Alden had never lived, yet now felt with terrifying intensity. Alden's voice deepened, reshaped by emotions that were not his own, describing a man's last moments beneath a collapsing structure, his lungs filling with dust, his final thought begging someone to remember his name. He gasped violently, gripping the crate until it would splintered beneath his fingers, saying the memory burned hotter than fire, searing through him, as though that long-dead man's pain had reignited inside his chest. The lantern beside him flickered violently, and Alden's breath stuttered as the final presence completed its passage, leaving him trembling, drained, and hollowed out as though emptied of every borrowed life. He slumped forward, whispering that the memories had released him at last, stepping away into whatever quiet realm waited for stories finally spoken aloud through his failing body. Alden closed his eyes briefly, gathering what remained of himself, saying he could feel his own memories returning to the forefront, stripped clean of the fractures caused by lives that were never meant to be his. He stood with great effort and stepped outside into the morning sun, saying he wished to face the world as himself one final time, free of the voices that had shaped him for far too long. The men followed him silently as he walked toward the lone hill overlooking Grayford, each step unsteady yet purposeful, as though guided by a promise he had waited centuries to fulfill. Atop the hill, Alden inhaled deeply, a long, slow breath that carried decades of quiet endurance, then said he felt light for the first time since childhood, unburdened by centuries pressing against his spine. He looked toward the valley with eyes filled not with fear but with a soft acceptance, saying the lives he carried had finally found rest, and now it was his turn to follow them into stillness. Alden's body swayed, weakened by the toll of release, and he asked the men to remain with him, saying no man deserved to meet his end alone after carrying so many voices through endless years. He lowered himself onto the grass, sunlight warming his face, and told them his true age at last, not to impress or astonish, but to leave behind no confusion about the span he had endured. The number was impossible, yet every man believed him without hesitation, the truth carried unmistakably in the quiet resignation etched across his features as the final remnants of borrowed time slipped away. Alden exhaled shakily, saying he felt no pain, only the gentle unraveling of a life stretched far beyond its natural limits, each heartbeat softer than the last, fading like ripples on calm water. He thanked them with a fading voice for witnessing his final hours, saying collective memory was all any man truly had to ensure his existence did not drift into silence after death. His breaths slowed until they became barely perceptible, and the men leaned in, listening intently as the last thread of Alden Rourke's impossible life unraveled beneath the warming spring sunlight. At last, His chest stilled completely, his features relaxing into serene stillness, and the men bowed their heads, understanding that they had witnessed something no century of science could ever fully explain. The wind rose suddenly, sweeping across the hilltop as though gathering remnants of the lives Alden had carried, lifting them into the morning sky where they scattered softly into the vast, waiting quiet.